In the spring of 1945, the gates began to open. At places like Liberation of Dachau and Liberation of Buchenwald, American soldiers stepped into a world that defied comprehension. Survivors, starved, exhausted, barely alive, stumbled toward them. Some wept. Some couldn't speak at all. For many, this moment marked the end of a nightmare that had consumed years of their lives. Photographs would later capture these scenes. Emaciated bodies, striped uniforms, hollow eyes staring into the lens. The world would come to see these images as proof of liberation, of evil defeated, of justice beginning. But not every survivor walked out of those gates into freedom. Some were pulled aside. They didn't wear the same symbols as the others. While many prisoners had been marked with yellow stars, red triangles, or political badges, these men had worn something different. A pink triangle stitched onto their uniforms. Inside the camps, that small piece of fabric had marked them as among the lowest of the low, isolated, abused, often targeted not only by guards, but by fellow prisoners. And when the war ended, that mark did not disappear. Because for these men, the reason they had been imprisoned in the first place had never been erased from the law. Years before the Nazis came to power, Germany already had a statute known as Paragraph 175, criminalizing male homosexuality. Under Adolf Hitler, the law was expanded and brutally enforced. Tens of thousands were arrested. Many were sent to concentration camps. Thousands died there. But in 1945, when the regime collapsed, Paragraph 175 did not collapse with it. Instead, it remained. So, while the world celebrated liberation, a quiet, uncomfortable process unfolded behind the scenes. In some cases, men who had survived the camps were not released as victims. They were classified as criminals. Their sentences, it was argued, had not been fully served, and so, instead of returning home, they were transferred, sometimes directly, into prisons run by the very state that was now trying to rebuild itself. No parades waited for them. No recognition followed. No one spoke their names. For decades, their stories remained buried, overshadowed by the scale of the war, ignored by governments, and silenced by fear. Many survivors never told anyone where they had been. Not because they had nothing to say, but because saying it could destroy what little life they had managed to rebuild. History remembered the liberation of the camps, but it almost forgot the prisoners who were never truly freed. This is their story. Long before the camps, before the uniforms, before the pink triangle, there was a law. It didn't look extraordinary. It wasn't introduced with speeches about race or empire. It didn't come with marching soldiers or burning flags. On paper, it was just another paragraph in the German Criminal Code, Paragraph 175. It had existed since 1871, when the German Empire unified its legal system. The wording was simple. Sexual relations between men were illegal, punishable by imprisonment. But for decades, the law lived in a strange gray zone. In the years of the Weimarske Republika, Germany was, paradoxically, one of the most culturally progressive places in the world. Berlin in the 1920s became a center of nightlife, art, and sexual openness. There were bars, clubs, and publications that openly discussed homosexuality. Doctors and researchers began to study it, not as a crime, but as part of human identity. One of the most prominent figures of that era was Magnus Hirschfeld, a physician and sexologist who argued that homosexuality was natural and should not be punished. He founded the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin, a place where people could seek advice, research was conducted, and a different future seemed possible. For a brief moment, it looked like Paragraph 175 might disappear altogether. But laws don't exist in isolation. They wait. They survive political change. And when the climate shifts, they can be weaponized. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, they didn't invent persecution out of nothing. They inherited a legal framework, and they expanded it. Under Adolf Hitler, the regime quickly moved to destroy the fragile freedoms of the Weimar years. Hirschfeld's institute was raided. Its books and archives were dragged into the streets and burned. The idea that homosexuality could be accepted was erased almost overnight. But the real shift came in 1935. That year, the Nazis rewrote paragraph 175, broadening its scope dramatically. Before, the law had required proof of specific acts. Now, suspicion alone could be enough. A glance, a letter, a rumor, any of it could be interpreted as evidence. The definition of criminal behavior became so vague that it allowed authorities to arrest almost anyone they targeted. And they did. Between 1933 and 1945, an estimated 100,000 men were arrested under paragraph 175. Around 50,000 were convicted. Thousands were sent to prisons. And thousands more were sent to concentration camps. The arrests weren't random. They were systematic. The Nazi state relied on denunciations, neighbors, co-workers, even family members reporting each other. Police kept lists. Interrogations were often brutal. Confessions were extracted under pressure. Once someone was identified, it became almost impossible to escape the system. And unlike other groups targeted by the regime, these men had almost no support network. Their families often rejected them. Society viewed them as criminals long before the Nazis intensified the persecution. There were no large organizations defending them, no political movements powerful enough to intervene. They were isolated, which made them easy to target. By the late 1930s, the pipeline was fully established. Arrest led to interrogation. Interrogation led to conviction. And for many, conviction led somewhere far worse than prison: the concentration camps. But what made their situation unique was this. Even within that system of terror, they were marked as different. Not just enemies of the state, not just prisoners, but something the regime considered less than human. And that distinction would follow them all the way through the war. And, as it turned out, long after it ended. Inside the camps, identity was reduced to a shape. A small piece of fabric, stitched onto a striped uniform, determined everything: where you stood, who you spoke to, how you were treated, and often, whether you survived. Prisoners were no longer known by their names. They were classified, sorted, and labeled with colored triangles: red for political prisoners, green for criminals, yellow for Jews. And then there was pink. For the men arrested under paragraph 175, the pink triangle became both a mark of accusation and a sentence in itself. In camps like Dachau concentration camp and Buchenwald concentration camp, it placed them at the very bottom of an already brutal hierarchy. The camps were not just systems of imprisonment. They were systems of control built on division. The Nazis encouraged separation between groups, reinforcing mistrust and hostility. Privileges, however small, were distributed unevenly. Some prisoners were given positions of authority over others. Survival often depended on where you fell within this structure. Men with the pink triangle fell to the lowest rung. They were often assigned the hardest, most dangerous labor: quarries, construction sites, tasks that broke the body quickly. They were frequently isolated from other prisoner groups. Even among inmates, they were seen as outcasts. In a place where everyone was suffering, they were the ones few were willing to stand beside. Testimonies from survivors describe beatings that went unreported, punishments that went further, and a level of vulnerability that had no protection. Guards targeted them openly. Capos, prisoners given authority, often did the same. There was little chance of solidarity. The stigma that existed outside the camps followed them inside, amplified by the system itself. The pink triangle did more than identify. It dehumanized. In a regime obsessed with hierarchy and purity, these men were portrayed as a threat to the very structure of society. Nazi ideology framed them as weak, corrupting, incompatible with the future the regime claimed to be building. And inside the camps, that belief translated into daily reality. Some were subjected to medical experiments. Others were placed in conditions where survival was almost impossible. The exact number of those who died wearing the pink triangle is still debated, but historians agree that their mortality rate was among the highest of any prisoner group. And yet, their suffering remained largely invisible. Unlike other groups, they had almost no one advocating for them during the war or after it. Their stories were rarely recorded in the immediate aftermath. Many who survived chose silence, knowing that even outside the barbed wire, the stigma had not disappeared. In the camps, prisoners learned quickly what the colors meant. Red might mean political resistance. Yellow marked a target of racial hatred. Green could mean criminal status. But pink meant isolation. It meant that even in a place defined by cruelty, there was still a deeper level to fall. And when liberation finally came, when the gates opened and the guards fled, many believed that these labels would disappear along with the regime that created them. They were wrong, because the symbol could be removed from the uniform, but the judgment behind it was still written into the law. By April 1945, the war was collapsing in on itself. Allied forces were pushing deep into Germany. Cities were in ruins. The Nazi regime was disintegrating. And across the country, the gates of the camps began to open. At Buchenwald concentration camp, prisoners had already started to organize an internal uprising as American troops approached. At Dachau concentration camp, U.S. soldiers encountered scenes so horrifying that many later said they could barely process what they were seeing. Starvation, disease, mass graves, evidence of a system built on industrialized cruelty. For most prisoners, this moment marked the end. They were liberated, given medical care, documented as victims of a regime that had nearly destroyed them. Their suffering, at least in part, was acknowledged. But for some, the process unfolded differently. In the chaos of liberation, Allied authorities faced an immediate problem: how to sort, process, and categorize tens of thousands of survivors. Camps had held people for many reasons: political prisoners, forced laborers, prisoners of war, civilians accused of crimes. Not everyone inside had been imprisoned under the same legal framework. So classifications mattered, records were reviewed, prisoners were questioned, backgrounds were checked when possible. And in many cases, individuals were grouped based on the reason they had been arrested in the first place. For men who had worn the pink triangle, that reason created a dangerous ambiguity. Because while the Nazi system that had sent them to the camps was gone, the law that labeled them criminals had not disappeared with it. Paragraph 175 was still in effect. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Allied forces often relied on existing German legal structures to maintain order. There was no instant legal reset. Courts, police systems, and criminal codes, many of them remained in place, at least temporarily, as new administrations tried to stabilize a shattered country. And under that system, homosexuality was still illegal. This created a quiet, uncomfortable contradiction. On one hand, the world was beginning to understand the scale of Nazi crimes. Trials were being prepared. Evidence was being collected. The term concentration camp survivor was starting to carry moral weight. On the other hand, some of the people who had survived those camps were still considered offenders under the law. In practical terms, this meant that liberation did not always lead to freedom. Some men were released, but without recognition as victims. Others were transferred into civilian custody. In certain cases, time spent in concentration camps was not counted as time served for their original convictions. Legally, they were still expected to complete their sentences. The result was surreal. A man could survive forced labor, starvation, and abuse in a concentration camp, only to find himself standing in front of a post-war official, being told that his punishment was not over. No ceremony marked this transition. No photographs captured it. It didn't fit the narrative of victory and liberation that the world wanted to tell. So it stayed, mostly invisible. Even among survivors, the difference became clear quickly. Some were sent home, reunited with families, recognized as victims of persecution. Others left the camps quietly, without support, without acknowledgement, and sometimes without true freedom. The gates had opened, but for them, the system had not ended. It had simply changed form. For many survivors, liberation meant a beginning. For others, it was an interruption. In the months after 1945, Germany was divided, occupied, and struggling to rebuild. New administrations were forming under Allied supervision, but the reality on the ground was far less clear. Courts reopened, police forces resumed operations, and in many cases, they relied on the same legal code that had existed before and during the Nazi regime. Paragraph 175 was still there. It had not been abolished with the fall of Adolf Hitler. It had not been immediately rewritten. In fact, the version expanded by the Nazis in 1935 remained in force in what would become West Germany, which meant that, legally, nothing had changed for the men it targeted. For those who had been arrested before or during the war, the consequences were immediate. Records still existed. Convictions were still valid. And time spent in a concentration camp was not automatically recognized as time served for a criminal sentence. So in some cases, the process was brutally simple. A survivor was identified. His previous conviction was reviewed, and instead of being released fully, he was transferred, sometimes directly, into a civilian prison, from one system of confinement to another. There were no announcements, no public acknowledgement that this was happening. It didn't align with the narrative of justice that the post-war world was trying to construct. The focus was on prosecuting Nazi crimes, rebuilding nations, and moving forward. But this reality remained in the background. Men who had already endured years in camps like Buchenwald concentration camp or Dachau concentration camp found themselves behind bars again, this time under a government that claimed to represent a new beginning. And the conditions they faced did not necessarily reflect that promise. Post-war prisons were harsh, overcrowded, and under-resourced. Germany was in ruins. Infrastructure was damaged. Food was scarce. The legal system was overwhelmed. In that environment, there was little room for nuance, and even less for reconsidering cases tied to laws that society still largely accepted. Because outside the prison walls, attitudes had not shifted as quickly as political systems. Homosexuality was still widely viewed as immoral, dangerous, even criminal. The stigma that had isolated these men inside the camps continued to isolate them in civilian life. There were no public campaigns defending them, no widespread calls for their release. In many cases, even their families did not know, or did not want to know, the truth about why they had been imprisoned. So, silence became survival. Those who were released often avoided speaking about their past. Admitting where they had been and why could mean losing work, housing, relationships. It could mean returning to prison. It could mean being erased from society in a different way. And unlike other victims of the Nazi regime, they received no recognition, no compensation, no official status as survivors, no place in the growing narrative of remembrance. The world was beginning to say, never again. But for them, the past had not ended. It had simply been reclassified, and the system that once marked them with a pink triangle had been replaced by one that didn't need symbols at all. Because the judgment was already written into the law. When the war ended, Europe began the long process of remembering. Memorials were built. Testimonies were recorded. Entire categories of victims were slowly acknowledged: political prisoners, resistance fighters, survivors of racial persecution. Over time, compensation programs were introduced. Governments issued statements. The language of remembrance took shape. But not everyone was included in that process. For the men once marked with the pink triangle, the silence didn't end in 1945. In many ways, it deepened. Because the problem wasn't just what had happened to them during the war. It was what still defined them after it. In West Germany, paragraph 175 remained in force for decades. And not just in theory, it continued to be actively enforced. Between 1949 and 1969, tens of thousands of men were investigated or prosecuted under the same legal framework that had been intensified under Nazi rule. For survivors, this created an impossible situation. To be recognized as a victim of the camps, they would have had to explain why they were there. But doing so meant admitting to something that was still considered a crime. It meant exposing themselves to legal risk, social rejection, and, in some cases, renewed prosecution. So most stayed silent. They didn't apply for compensation. They didn't give interviews. They didn't write memoirs. Their absence from the historical record wasn't because they had no story to tell. It was because telling it came at too high a cost. This silence shaped how history itself was written. Early accounts of the camps rarely mentioned prisoners, marked with the pink triangle. When they did appear, it was often in passing, without detail or context. Archives remained incomplete. Testimonies were missing. Entire lives disappeared between the lines of official reports. And outside the world of documentation, the stigma persisted. Post-war society, especially in the 1950s, leaned toward conservatism. Stability, family structure, and traditional morality were emphasized as part of rebuilding. In that environment, there was little room to revisit laws like paragraph 175, or to question the assumptions behind them, which meant that for decades these men lived in a kind of historical void. They had survived one of the most brutal systems of persecution in modern history, but they were not publicly recognized as victims of it. They were not invited into the narrative of survival and resilience that began to define the post-war era. Instead, they existed on the margins, legally vulnerable, socially isolated, and largely forgotten. It wasn't until much later, as attitudes began to shift in the 1960s and beyond, that cracks started to appear in that silence. Younger generations began to question inherited norms. Social movements challenged existing laws, and events like the Stonewall Bunty signaled a broader change that extended beyond any single country. But by then, decades had already passed. Many survivors had grown old without ever speaking publicly about what they endured. Others had died, their stories never recorded, their experiences never fully understood. History had moved forward, but for a long time, it had moved forward without them. History doesn't just record events, it filters them. What gets remembered is rarely a simple reflection of what happened. It is shaped by law, politics, and, perhaps most powerfully, by what societies are willing to admit about themselves. And for decades after World War II, Western Europe, especially West Germany, was not ready to confront what had happened to the men once marked with the pink triangle. The reason wasn't ignorance. The facts were there. The reason was continuity. One of the most uncomfortable truths of the post-war period is that not everything changed in 1945. While the Nazi regime collapsed, many of its legal structures, particularly those not seen as uniquely Nazi, remained in place. Paragraph 175 was one of them. And because it had existed before Hitler, it was treated not as a tool of dictatorship, but as a legitimate part of the legal system. This distinction mattered. It allowed post-war authorities to draw a line between what they considered criminal persecution and what they saw as lawful enforcement. Political prisoners were victims. Racial persecution was condemned. But men convicted under paragraph 175 were categorized differently, not as targets of injustice, but as offenders whose punishment had been, at least in principle, justified. This wasn't just a legal argument. It was a moral one. Recognizing these men as victims would have required society to question the law itself, to admit that something still considered illegal might also have been unjust. And in the conservative climate of the 1950s, that was a step few were willing to take. So recognition was delayed, not because it was impossible, but because it was inconvenient. The turning point began not with governments, but with social change. By the late 1960s, a new generation started challenging inherited norms. Across Europe and the United States, movements emerged that questioned authority, tradition, and the boundaries of personal freedom. In this context, laws like paragraph 175 began to face increasing scrutiny. The shift was gradual. In 1969, West Germany reformed the law, limiting its scope. It was no longer enforced in the same sweeping way as before, but it wasn't abolished. Not yet. That would take another 25 years, until 1994, when a unified Germany finally removed paragraph 175 from its criminal code entirely. Even then, legal change did not automatically produce historical recognition. For decades, the official narrative of World War II had already been established. Memorials had been built. Compensation programs had been structured. Categories of victims had been defined and, crucially, limited. Those who didn't fit those categories remained outside them. It wasn't until the late 20th and early 21st centuries that governments began to revisit these exclusions. Historians pushed for a broader understanding of persecution. Activists demanded acknowledgement. Archival research uncovered testimonies that had long been ignored or suppressed. And slowly, the narrative began to expand. Germany would eventually take steps toward formal recognition. Convictions under paragraph 175 were reviewed. In 2017, the German government officially annulled many of those convictions and introduced compensation for surviving victims. But by that point, most of the men affected were already gone. Which raises a difficult question. What does justice mean when it arrives too late? Recognition, in this case, became less about restoring individual lives and more about correcting the historical record. It was an admission, not just of past suffering, but of decades of neglect. An acknowledgement that silence itself had been part of the injustice, and that silence had consequences. Because for years, the absence of these stories shaped how the war was understood. It created a version of history that was incomplete, not in its facts, but in its scope. Certain experiences were centered. Others were pushed to the margins, not erased entirely, but not fully seen either. The long road to recognition wasn't just about changing laws. It was about changing the boundaries of memory and understanding that what a society chooses to remember often reveals as much as what it once tried to forget. Some stories disappear because there is no evidence. This wasn't one of them. The documents existed. The law was written. The arrests were recorded. The camps were real. And the men who survived them were still alive after the war. There was no mystery about what had happened. And yet, for decades, this story remained on the margins of history, not erased completely, but never fully acknowledged. To understand why, you have to look at what didn't change in 1945. Because while the regime of Adolf Hitler collapsed, much of the legal and moral framework that existed before, and in some cases during, his rule remained intact. Paragraph 175 was not seen as a uniquely Nazi invention. It had been part of German law long before the Third Reich. That fact gave it a kind of legitimacy in the eyes of post-war authorities. And legitimacy changes everything. It allowed governments to separate what they defined as Nazi crimes from what they considered ordinary law. The persecution of Jews, political opponents, and other targeted groups was recognized as injustice. But men prosecuted under paragraph 175 fell into a different category. They had been punished under a law that still existed, which meant acknowledging them as victims would require something deeper than condemning the past. It would require questioning the present. And that was a line most societies were not ready to cross. Because the issue wasn't just legal, it was cultural. Post-war Europe, especially in the 1950s, was built on a desire for stability. After years of chaos, destruction, and moral collapse, there was a push toward order, toward clear norms, traditional family structures, and a return to what was seen as normal. In that environment, homosexuality was not viewed as something to reconsider. It was viewed as something to suppress. So the silence was not accidental. It was reinforced. Governments avoided the topic because it complicated the narrative of justice. Legal systems avoided it because it challenged existing laws. And society avoided it because it confronted deeply ingrained beliefs about morality and identity. But there was another factor, one that made the silence even more complete: the survivors themselves. Unlike other groups, these men had powerful reasons not to speak. Telling their stories meant admitting to something that could still be prosecuted. It meant exposing themselves to social rejection, to loss of work, to isolation. It meant risking everything in a world that had already shown them how easily it could turn against them. So many chose not to tell their stories at all. And when people don't speak, history struggles to listen. This created a feedback loop. Because there were fewer testimonies, historians wrote less about them. Because historians wrote less, public awareness remained low. And because awareness remained low, there was little pressure on governments to revisit the issue. Silence became self-sustaining. Over time, this absence shaped the broader narrative of World War II. The story that emerged was not false, but it was incomplete. It focused on categories of victims that were easier for society to recognize and honor. It left out those whose existence challenged ongoing legal and moral norms, which reveals something important about how history works. History is not just a record of events. It is a process of selection, and selection is influenced by power, by culture, and by comfort. Some stories are elevated because they unite people around a clear moral lesson. Others remain in the background because they force uncomfortable questions about laws that remained in place, about attitudes that persisted, about the gap between justice and reality. This was one of those stories. It wasn't hidden because it didn't matter. It was hidden because it mattered in a way that society wasn't ready to confront. And by the time it was, decades later, much of the human cost had already been lost to time. Which leaves us with a final, difficult realization. What we remember about the past is never neutral. And sometimes, what a society chooses to forget tells you more than what it chooses to remember. In 1945, the world believed it had seen the worst humanity could do. The camps were opened. The crimes were exposed. The images spread across newspapers, across continents, across history itself. And from that moment on, a promise began to take shape: never again. It sounded absolute. It felt final. But history is rarely that simple. Because while the world focused on what had ended, it paid less attention to what continued. Laws remained. Attitudes remained. Silence remained. And in that silence, entire lives were pushed out of the story. The men once marked with the pink triangle did not vanish. They went back into society, quietly, carefully, often alone. Some built new lives under the weight of a past they could never fully explain. Others carried the memory in silence, knowing that speaking about it could cost them everything they had managed to rebuild. They had survived the camps, but survival is not the same as recognition. For decades, their absence shaped how the war was remembered. Textbooks were written, memorials were built, names were honored. But not all names, not all stories, not all truths. And that absence mattered. Because history is not just about what is recorded. It's about what becomes visible, what is acknowledged, what is allowed to exist in the collective memory. When a story is missing, it doesn't just disappear. It changes the meaning of everything around it. Only much later, generations later, did the silence begin to break. Laws were finally repealed. Convictions were overturned. Governments issued statements that came decades too late. And historians began to fill in the gaps that had been left behind. But by then, most of the people who lived the story were no longer there to hear it. Which raises a question that goes beyond this one history. How many stories never made it back? How many people survived something the world would never fully understand? Not because it wasn't important, but because it was inconvenient to remember. The liberation of the camps is one of the most documented moments of the 20th century. But even in that moment, even at the point where history seems the clearest, there were stories already beginning to disappear, not erased in a single act, not hidden by a single decision, but slowly, quietly, over time. And maybe that is the most unsettling part of all, because it means history doesn't just forget. Sometimes it chooses to look away.